Okay. Um, Good afternoon or good morning to everyone who is joining in for today's webinar. I'm happy to see that the number of participants and attendees who join in is slowly growing. I want to give a quick introduction and I also want to welcome our guest speaker from today, David O'Byrne from Loughborough University in the United Kingdom. And he will speak to us today on the topic of sport for development and peace, moving forward sport for development and peace with locally designed and led programs. You will get some background on research, and we will also have some interactive questions. But David will explain to you a little bit more what he's going to present today in just a couple of seconds. Um, yeah, that is, I think, the second or third time that David is speaking on our webinars. So yeah, we are very grateful to have him on today again. Just a couple of logistical things at the beginning. Um, I think for those of you who are here on this webinar platform for the first time, you might have seen that there is on the right-hand side a chat box and a chat history also. Some of you have already said hello to each other. I want to encourage you during the presentation that David is going to give us to ask questions whenever they arise, and I will keep an eye on these on the chat box and bring the questions to David's attention. So don't hold on to your questions. Uh, so post them as soon as they come to your mind and as soon as they arise, and then we will try to answer them in a timely manner. Um, yeah. Um, Other than that, I don't think you need to, um, yeah, know anything else or consider anything else. I would suggest we start into today's presentation, and we'll see if a couple of more participants join in. Okay, again, welcome to David. Welcome to our webinar today, and thank you for presenting to us.
Thank you very much, Marcus. It's my pleasure to be asked back to speak to the virtual learning community of coaches across continents. So I'd first of all like to thank Marcus for the invite, and then also thank you all for taking the time to log on to the webinar today. So hopefully it will be of use to you, and not just in terms of your learning, but in terms of the conversation that we can have at the end and the questions that might come up from that. So, in terms of just outlining the agenda for what I would like to talk about today, I'm hoping that I will present my material in about 20 to 25 minutes, and that will leave us. I deliberately wanted to leave at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions and for conversation. And I think that's a very important point because one of the reasons why I like Coaches Across Confidence and like these kind of platforms is that it's a place where we can build a bridge between the kind of research that's going on in academia about the use of sport for development, but also actually talking to you guys as practitioners who are out there implementing this kind of work, and to make sure that we continue to learn from each other and keep a dialogue going. So the agenda, as I've outlined here, is basically I'll give you a little bit more background for those of you who don't know who I am and the university I'm at, and then we'll get into the content, which is basically points 2 and 3. So we'll talk about what we mean by local led programs and why people are calling for them in research. So we'll get into discussing about whose knowledge is being factored into the kind of development that is happening through the use of sport, and then also who's benefiting most in terms of whether a program is local led or has more input or influence from external agencies, particularly those in the global north. If that's a term you're not familiar with, that will come up later on, and I will explain all the terms that I'm trying to get across today. So point 3 then is talking about 3 concepts that will help us understand why there is this real push for local led programs. So the dangers of not following that call will be outlined through the use of 3 concepts, which I will take time to go through individually, and then try and wrap it back up together in terms of how these relate to the use of sport for development. And as I've said, point 4, we will have at least 15 to 20 minutes for questions and conversation. As Marcus said as well, do feel free to type your questions as we go. And at the end of each slide, if there's something that you need me to clarify or I was unclear on, please just let me know. Or if you have a thought or an opinion that you want to share with the group, happy to discuss it, because I do want this to be a kind of a collective experience. So in terms of who I am, that's me circled in the bottom right of those pictures, and some of the field work I do. As Marcus said, my name is David O'Byrne. I'm at Loughborough University in the UK, which is that little red dot on the map there in the centre of England. If you're confused about my accent, I'm from Ireland originally, which is the country just to the west there of the UK. And as I said, my research in Loughborough University is focused on the use of sport for development and peace. So you will hear me slipping into using the acronym SDP. I always just include a paragraph here to say that there's a lot of other terms that are all trying to talk about the same thing, which is the use of sport to achieve a particular social goal or a social improvement. So you'll see terms such as sport for development, sport for social change, sport for social impact, or sport for good. A lot of these terms are interchangeable. And some of the research I've been doing in my PhD studies has partnered with coaches across continents. And the reason why I do this is because of my belief in their understanding of the need for knowledge to be shared globally through the use of sport for development. So it's not just a case of that Coaches Across Continents is an organization who is in the know and is trying to spread that knowledge, but they're very much focused on trying to keep a conversation and a sharing of knowledge across the world between practitioners and academics in places regardless of where they're born or where the programs have taken place. So you'll see the use of their terminology around education outside the classroom, again talking about the social aspects of the use of sport. So about Loughborough University, again, as I mentioned, it's based in the UK. And if you Google around Loughborough University or if you read about it in the news, often you will hear more about the work that's done with professional athletes in terms of improving their sporting performance. But as I've made clear, the kind of work that I do and the smaller group that in the university is not focused on athletes' sporting performance, but again, the use of sport for development. So you see in the purple text here around this belief in using sport only as a tool to meet specific social goals and non-sporting ends that can help improve societies. Okay, so now that the introductions are made clear, let's talk about the content today. So the headline that you would have read in your invitation was about the calls in academia for more local-led sport for development programs. So let's start by first talking about what we mean by local-led SDP. So these are programs where local people's knowledge, voices, and priorities are fundamental in shaping the work of the program. So you see the use of the phrase self-determination. So what's important to get across here is that the local people's priorities and initiatives are the top priority in terms of how a program is conceived, how it's then implemented, and how it's then measured, and the legacy of the program. Now, when we talk about what we mean by local knowledge, there's also an important distinction here, because you will see within some programs or within some literature talking about local knowledge in the sense of practicalities. So locals, of course, will have better knowledge when it comes to understanding things like how to get from point A to point B, what transport systems are available, the opening hours of where you might go and buy resources, whether you can build something in a particular area or whether that's a floodplain. So these are very much local knowledge at a practical level. But what's really important here is the distinction in terms of STP and the use of local knowledge in STP is it is talking about a much higher level of local knowledge. It's local knowledge in the sense of how locals see the world, how they understand the world, and what they want their world to look like. So again, yes, practicalities are important, but recognizing this important distinction between a higher level of what we mean by knowledge and that knowledge is taken seriously from the outset through to completion. Again, please feel free to post questions as we go. Okay, so why I say the importance of not just what we mean by knowledge, but in terms of how it's integrated into a program. There was some interesting research done a few years back by some Norwegians, you see cited there, Straum and Hasselgaard. Now, they did a case study with some Norwegian funding for SDP work in Zimbabwe. And what they found in terms of the interviews that they did, both in Norway and in Zimbabwe, and in the materials that were produced around these funding schemes, was the use of a very important phrase. And that phrase I've quoted here, which is the Norwegians who are funding programs mentioning that they, in this case meaning the locals in Zimbabwe, they need to get the feeling that these are their ideas. So while you may see, I'm not saying anything new because we've all heard about the importance of local led projects and the benefits that it can deliver. It is important to recognize that while you may see that in policy documents, in materials, in funding documents, that there is still this hidden element of how seriously this local knowledge is taken. So for the Norwegian funders to use this kind of language around need to get the feeling. So it's like creating a sense or a facade that they're local led ideas that are being taken seriously. But in reality, they already have a predetermined plan and template. And it's their knowledge and their expertise that they want to implement, but want locals to feel like it's their idea. And I include the phrase trusteeship there. And that's important because trusteeship can basically be broadly defined as meaning someone who has the knowledge, the skills, and the funding to define themselves as developers on behalf of someone else. So, again, in this case, it's Norwegian funders being a developer of Zimbabwean communities. So, in terms of kind of unpicking and questioning our own role in this, I've put in some example questions here that make us think about power relations. So we might consider, for example, what are the goals for the program and who decided them? Was it genuinely local led voices and knowledge that led to the creation of the goals? Was it a negotiation? Or was it funders who really decided what the goals should be and should look like? How will those be achieved? That's point B. So what mechanisms will be used to try and achieve these goals? Again, who is deciding these elements? How will success be measured? So how will we decide if we've achieved these goals that have been set and whether a program will continue to receive more funding? Again, who has made these decisions of what success looks like and how it will be measured? And then the conditions attached to receive funding in the first place or based on continued support. So what terms and conditions are attached to funding? So there are some questions that we might reflect on in terms of your own work, either within funding agencies or within running programs based on the use of sport for social development to make us think about these power dynamics and consider, are we truly trying to incorporate local led thoughts and knowledge, and are alternatives being considered? So this leads to the point about self-determination and why it's needed. And to do this justice, what I want to do is introduce three big concepts but I want to kind of give a simple explanation of what each of them are, and then I'll tie back to why this is important in light of work for sport for development and peace and the use of local led programs. So the three concepts I have outlined here are this global north and global south, and I'll explain each of these in turn on slides that follow. Neoliberalism and neocolonialism. Now, why these concepts are important to understand is think about the phrase I just used about trusteeship. So this sense of external control, because someone has deemed that they have the right knowledge, the right skills, and the right economic power or funding to define themselves as developers. So you might say to me, what's the problem if Norwegian funders are setting up programs in Zimbabwe? And for example, we can point to really obvious, easy benefits. So stuff as simple as they're coming over and setting up programs and giving out free t-shirts, maybe donating sports equipment, maybe providing meals to children. How can any of these be bad things? Well, to question that, that's why we need to think about these three concepts in terms of what role those obvious benefits and easy benefits have within a larger sense of global inequality, and whether we're using sport for development to challenge those global inequalities. So initiatives that appear as being very progressive can be attached to either accidentally repeating larger structural inequalities. And again, I will go through each of these concepts individually now, and please just let me know if I'm not being clear or if you have any questions or comments as we go. Sorry, the slide skipped forward there. Okay, so the first concept is this idea of a global north and a global south. So in broad terms, this global divide is between a rich global north, and when I say rich, I'm talking about financial wealth and national economic worth, and a relatively poor global south, again, in terms of financial wealth and global economic worth. Now, the maps, various maps, we don't have to get hung up in terms of the IMF definitions, but essentially it looks at economic output of a particular country and how many people are in that country to give the per person purchasing power. And what you see is when you create a dividing line of $10,700 per person, the countries in blue are in the global north predominantly, and the countries who fall below this line are predominantly in the global south, particularly in Africa and South Asia. So this is important to recognize that we do have this divide in the globe, and then to tie in this idea of world systems theory. So what does that mean? That means that these wealthy countries in blue in this global north-south divide enjoy the benefits of having power and wealth control to exploit poorer peripheral countries, and that exploitation can be in the form of labor, materials, and resources, for example. So again, thinking about STP, does STP begin to challenge this, or is it repeating and maybe accidentally reproducing this continued north-south divide? So that's the first of three concepts. The second concept is neoliberalism. So again, put at the most simple and broad terms, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is essentially a belief that if we create free market economies with little to no government interference or government activity, that we will end up with more powerful corporations who are taxed less and will have less public offerings. But there's a belief from an economic point of view that this will lead to developing economies in the global south. So neoliberalism within the sense of STP, and I'm just seeing Jordan's questions coming through. So yes, STP stands for Sport for Development and Peace. But there are various terms all built around this belief that we can use sport as a tool to achieve social goals and social development. So I call it STP, but you may use other acronyms. Again, we're all talking about this belief that sport is a tool for social development. So thank you, Jordan, for clarifying. So coming back to neoliberalism, so we have this belief that free market economies will lead to the best form of development. Now, what does that mean in practice? What will that look like in STP? And what will it mean to individuals? Well, what academic research in this area points to is neoliberalist development tends to focus on the belief that we can create responsible individuals who will become better future employees and consumers in a global system. So it puts the focus on the individual rather than looking at global structural inequalities. And there's a belief that individuals can progress themselves within current economic market structures. Now, that's where there's a problem because that ignores the fact that we already have this massive imbalance across what we've just called the global north and the global south, and the dominance that some countries and areas already have this privilege over others. So, if we spread this neoliberalist belief that we need to focus on individuals making themselves better rather than focusing on any kind of collective or global system, then can that ever truly lead to tackling inequality? Or will it just mean that relatively there will be improvements within specific communities and countries, but in terms of global north south divide, that inequality will never be addressed? So that's the idea around neoliberalism, the belief in a free market economy as being a solution for development, but it tends to ignore any kind of current structural inequality. And then the final of the three concepts is this idea of neocolonialism. So just to read the text on the slide, neocolonialism, it doesn't require armies. All it requires is economic, political, and cultural pressure to control or influence other countries. Now, what I hope I've made clear is this sense of neocolonialism should ring a bell with what we've talked about earlier in terms of the idea of trusteeship. Because trusteeship, again, was about particular countries or funding organizations positioning themselves as having the right knowledge, the right skills, and the right economic clout in order to implement development. So, if we look at the phrases as to what neocolonialism is, you may not have funders or countries who are coming over requiring to do anything by force, but what they do have is economic pressure because they come from countries that are producing far more wealth economically. And they also have political and cultural pressure because, again, they're positioning themselves as being experts, having the best knowledge and the best skills for development based on the countries that they're coming from as being a demonstration of the kind of progress they've already achieved. So why don't you let us act as trustees in your country in terms of advising you, spreading our knowledge, our ideas, and our expertise? But where does that leave a space for local led knowledge, local led ideas in the creation, implementation, and measurement of programs that are using sport for social development? So I said what I would try to do is keep it to 20 to 25 minutes. We've just gone over the 20-minute mark. And this is my last slide before we get into more dialogue and questions with each other. So I'm trying to link, and I hope it's become clear, why these concepts help us understand the dangers of ignoring the calls for local-led development. I hope I've painted a picture of the bigger global inequalities at play across the global north and south divide and the dangers around countries exploiting their economic, cultural, and political powers in order to spread particular values. And what research has shown that in a lot of programs, those values tend to be neoliberalist values. Again, meaning that we promote a free market economy with less government interference, and we focus on individuals as being responsible for themselves, and we point to individual success as being their entry into a labor market, i.e., getting a job, and what they manage to consume and to buy with their money. But again, ignoring bigger structural inequality. And the danger that these neoliberalist values are being spread across from the global north to the global south through this idea of neocolonialism is that we end up accepting a message that playing and winning this capitalist game is down to individual efforts rather than any global structural inequalities. So it gives a belief that individuals are masters of their own destiny, and we need not worry about any kind of pre existing differences or structural inequalities. An individual will always have the power to decide what success or failure will be like in their lives, and they do this through their own actions. Now, what I'd like to finish with on this slide is that is not to say that individuals don't have choices and power. They absolutely do. And individuals can make better choices that will lead to improvements in their lives and in the lives of their families and in the lives of their communities. There is a sense of power and agency that individuals can change their own lives. However, we must also recognize that the choices that they can make fit within a broader structural inequality that can limit or constrain what choices they have, depending on what country you happen to be born in and what the economic power is of that country. So, what I hope to do now was get into 5 different conversation points. So, we'll go through them one by one. Unfortunately, this new webinar system doesn't have a poll that I can put up, but I was hoping we could just use the chat box. So let me first start by saying, before we get into these conversation points, if you have any questions from what I've just said, if you need me to clarify anything, if you have any opinions on what I just said, please share them in the box and we can talk about them as a group. What I will do is I'll start on point 1, and if those questions and comments come in the meantime, then I'll answer them as I can. There's a question coming in from Jordan. I'm curious to hear where our partners think CIC fits on neoliberalism and neocolonialism scale. Okay, so the partners who are on the call right now, hopefully what I've said has made sense. And to follow up on Jordan's point, it would be interesting to hear if you are a partner on this call who feels either what I've said makes a lot of sense to you in terms of your relationship with foreign agencies and countries and funders and the level of control they want and influence over your decision making, or whether you have examples to say, actually, none of that seems to apply to me. But what I would hope we can do is apply those kind of questions that I had at the outset in terms of questioning the power dynamics that fit within programs. So there's a comment coming in from Nancy. Individuals must work in an enabling environment to thrive, which can make them thrive or not succeed. How does this work with your last slide in the presentation? Thank you, Nancy, for your comment and question. So that's what I was trying to come to in terms of, no, that's fine, Nancy. I appreciate you typing quickly. That's what I was trying to get across, that some of the criticisms of the kind of research that I've kind of tried to summarize here and present will address Nancy's point, which is individuals working in an enabling environment that can make them thrive or not. So this comes back to a belief, and it is a fair belief, that individuals do, in a sense, control their own destiny. Now, that is very much a message, to Nancy's point, that neoliberalist values try and spread. What I'm saying is, I agree that individuals have choices and to an extent control their own destiny. How it fits together with the previous slides in terms of the global north south divide and neocolonialism is that we have to recognize that the choices that individuals make are limited. So the choices that you have as an individual, for example, we talked about Zimbabwe with the Norwegian funders, the examples you have as a 10-year-old girl growing up in Zimbabwe is different to a 10-year-old boy growing up in Norway. You both have choices. You both to an extent can determine your own success and failure, but there are limits on that menu of choice that you have afforded to you based on the fact of multiple elements that are cultural, political, and economic. So I've touched on gender there, whether you're born a boy or a girl, what country you happen to be born into, and the wealth of that country. Even within countries, within the UK, of course, you have class divides as well. So it's not just a case of anyone born in Zimbabwe is in some way lesser off than someone born in the UK or in Norway. You can have people born in the UK who are in a class where their choices are also limited. So I know that was a very long, drawn out way of getting across that I do recognize that individuals have choices, but we must also recognize that the bigger global system, that if we want choice to genuinely be equal, we need to address global inequalities. So in terms of time, what I'd like to do now is go keep any questions or comments that you have coming through or any follow-ups on what I've said and whether it makes sense or not. But I'd like to discuss some of your views. So if we just start with a simple yes or no question, agree or disagree, do you agree or disagree that there is this global north-south divide? So if you could just kind of by a quick show of hands, if you type agree that you recognize that there is this divide or not, that would be useful before we move on to kind of some follow-up questions in that area. Marcus, if you have your microphone enabled as well, obviously in terms of trying to scroll up when specific questions or comments are coming in from other people, can you, if you could keep a note of them and address them to me, then I'll try and make sure I don't miss anybody's question or comment.
Okay, I will do that. Thanks, David. Yeah, there was a question from Romina, which I thought was quite interesting. It's the one that is above my post that says, in your opinion, is acknowledging that enough, or would you then take specific actions as a grassroots organization? And I think she is referring to acknowledging the neoliberalism, neocolonialism. Um, so that would be, yeah. I don't know. What do you
Yeah,
think?
okay. Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, is acknowledging it enough? Absolutely not. I mean, I think it's important to first acknowledge and create awareness of this divide and of these elements of neoliberalism and neocolonialism. So, if you hear of a program that seems to have a lot of benefits in terms of promoting young people with access to education or giving them means to be better consumers, that's not automatically a bad thing, but let's address maybe why the goals of the program are based around making specific individuals successful rather than looking at broader social connections. In one of the problems, of course, in what I'm saying is in terms of how do you achieve that, that's the really hard question. And this is where maybe academia is failing because there's a lot of research that ends up looking at STP and criticizing it for saying, hey, hang on, all you're doing is reproducing neocolonialism and neoliberalism. And then that is, of course, the follow up question. But how do we avoid that? How do we do something new? And in terms of the something new, that kind of comes back to the content of what I opened with today. One of those calls is saying, hey, let's make sure that we have local led programs that genuinely looks at local knowledge, not just from a practical sense, but from how they see the world and how they want their world to be, and that can create other alternatives to this pure free market economy that can end up delivering some benefits, but also delivering a lot of problems. Just reading some other comments that have come through as well. So, Marcus, you had said, despite the differences between Zimbabwe and Norway, as an example, they are both born into a system that follows the dictatorship of GDP growth measurement, neoliberalism, etc. Yes, I mean that is basically the point of recognizing the concept of neoliberalism, is that it tries to repeat and spread itself. So we all end up believing in a message that whether a country's success or failure should be measured by GDP, by economic output per capita. That doesn't always reflect what that means for the quality of life for the individual. So this is where Sport for Development has to recognize that entrepreneurship and promoting youth access to jobs, yes, it's a good thing, but we also have to recognize that we have other means to try and decide what development looks like, and that should take into account the quality of life of the individual and of their social connections. Um, Marcus, have you been looking at questions and comments as they come through? Is there anything else you want to direct my way, or should I move on to conversation point two? Given that broadly people agree that there is some sense of a global north-south divide.
Yeah, I would. If you look at we can move on, but there was one more comment that just came in from Sam saying, yes, there is, and then especially with the issue of stereotypes based on coming from the south versus coming from the north. If I'm not sure if I
Mm-hmm.
understand that. I don't know if you do, David. But otherwise, Sam, if you could explain it a little bit more, do you? Yeah, I will first let David speak. Probably he understands what that means. I don't.
Um, so Sam, that in terms of stereotyping the global north versus global south, this is a very important point, because although in academia we tend to use these phrases global north and global south in terms of um, immediately kind of getting across this global structural inequality, I do recognize that there is a problem even in using the terms global north and south, because in a way, it also reinforces the stereotypes that if you're from the global south, you are therefore from a country that is economically underdeveloped, therefore you're less privileged. And there's also these stereotypes around, therefore, your knowledge may not be as good as someone in the global north, because if it was better, why wouldn't your country be more economically developed? So that is a massive danger about even using these terms. But I do think it's still important to use them in terms of recognizing that there is a global structural inequality, but then also recognizing that that doesn't mean, as you said, that stereotypes should be reinforced, that if you're from the global south, you're in some way lesser. If anything, that's exactly why local led programs in this call has come about, that we need to recognize that locals in global south countries have alternative ways of trying to achieve social progress. So let's try and see what they look like and how we can learn from you as well. I'm not sure where you're based, Sam, but I'm generalizing here in terms of the global south. Furthermore, on that point, that's not to say that in some way the global north is one entity that's all the same and the global south is one entity that's all the same. Of course, there's huge differences within the global north and within the global south in terms of their individual economic might, but also in terms of their cultures, their practices, their ways of seeing the world. So it's a very crude divide, but it's something that can be useful to show this line of massive inequality across the globe. I'm just seeing, I'm just trying to read stuff as it comes through. So there's a comment here from Jonathan. Yes, Marcus, and I would believe that they are increasingly involved in funding education and universities, reinforcing individual success and also a neoliberal worldview. In terms of a comment, Jonathan, I absolutely agree. This is, again, one of the questions around education and universities in particular, that the discipline I come from is sociology, and we talk about this growth of neoliberalism and neocolonialism. But of course, I recognize that the institution that I'm within in the UK is part of a neoliberal system, as are all universities, because we are promoting a view that individuals should decide their own success or failure in a market economy. So that's not to excuse universities in any way, shape, or form from being part of this system. I absolutely acknowledge your point that they are. Marcus, is there anything else you'd like me to address, or should we go on
No,
to
let's go
point
on to the
two?
next one. Thanks, David.
So, in your experience, do you agree or disagree that the global north influences how SDP, again, and talking about sport, use of sport for social development, how SDP operates in communities or countries in the global south? So, this would be just in terms of a general influence before we talk about whether that influence is negative or positive. In your experiences, have you seen constraints or templates kind of put forward to you of, if you want our support or you want our funding, then here's particular models that you need to follow, or here's particular goals that you have to achieve, or here's how we will measure success, the kind of questions that I posted earlier on. So if that's something that you agree that is happening in your own experiences, maybe just let us know if you agree. And if you have a specific line or sentence around the kind of limitations or constraints that are put on you because the global north is seen to have this knowledge or development skill set, or indeed the economic clout to decide what development looks like in your community. So um, again, the general consensus, I haven't seen anybody disagree, but there are different ways of talking about how they see this influence of the global north over the global south in terms of the kind of global organizations that are deciding what the SDP agenda looks like and in what countries it's rolled out. Sam talks about specifically funding guidelines. If you have a specific example, Sam, of what the kind of guideline you have to follow would be, and how that constrains or influences what you do. I'm just scrolling back up. Jonathan, I think that part of the point I would like to make is that it reinforces the need for local view development through sports and other non-formal educational and development. Yeah, I guess, let me know, Jonathan, if I'm misunderstanding your point. But broadly, yes, that was the point of today's presentation, is to put forward this view that we need to see more truly local led development, not just operating as a facade or as a public relations tool. And of course, sport is one of those non-formal educational tools through which this can be done. Okay, so if we go on to question number 3, and again, Marcus, if you read anything that comes through that I'm missing, just let me know, and I'll address anything I can. So the third point was, in your experience, do you think the global north's influence is? So we're going to rate it from very positive 1, positive 2, neutral 3, negative 4, or very -5. And what I'm trying to get out here is some of the examples I gave earlier on, where there can be global north influence in terms of controlling what programs look like or what goals they try and achieve or how success is measured. But even these programs with a high sense of control may still be delivering some obvious benefits. And that can be simple things like helping create a program in the global south, providing sports equipment, providing t-shirts, providing trainers. They're ways that it's hard to say that it's a bad thing happening, but recognizing the concepts we talked about earlier, neoliberalism, neocolonialism, the global north-south divide, are they kind of a band-aid solution and actually repeating this bigger structural inequality? So in terms of ranking where you think this global north influence over the global south, given that most of you agreed that there is a global north-south divide and that global north funding is influencing global south activity, where would you put it? Is it entirely negative number 5, or are you a little bit kind of confused because there are some positives to seemingly these donations from the global north in terms of development funds? So just if you put a number up to let me know how positive or negative you view it, that would be interesting. As you're doing that, I'll take a look at some of the other comments that I've been missing. So, Jonathan, I'd love to hear more specifics. I'm just reading your point here of how funders don't even have the language to understand um, local realities and desires. And in your experience, that you're constantly having to translate, and obviously you put it in inverted commas, you don't literally mean language, but you mean uh, make the language into something that funders will accept and recognize as being of worth. So I'm wondering if it's a very interesting point. I'm wondering if there's any specific kind of idea or something you're trying to do that's being ignored or is being filtered or watered down because you have to go back to funders in a way that it will be something that will be appealing to them. But if you had free reign to do what you wanted with the fund, how it might look different, which is a question we'll come to. So in terms of the global north's influence, we're seeing mixed. There's some positive to it in that it can bring new ideas and open perspectives. Okay. Jonathan agrees with Paul that there's a mixture of positive and negative. Marcus is hesitating to put a number. He doesn't want to influence other people's opinion. The influence is positive, but mostly forces on quick sustainability of the local programs. This is mostly against the dynamics of each program community. So that's an interesting point from Sam as well, is that he does see a positive influence from the global north, but again, their way of doing development is focused on this quick sustainability of a local program, so that this doesn't necessarily fit with the dynamics of each program and community. Yeah, which is a very complex question because you might say, well, hang on, the global north influence recognize that they want programs to become local and sustainable, so therefore they're trying to get in and get out. But I guess my point would be there that maybe they'd be better off making sure that the program is sustainable and was filled with local knowledge, views, and goals from the outset, rather than trying to come in, have an influence, and then depart. But interesting to hear that point. There's quite a few comments coming in now. So if there's, again, Marcus, if there's anything I'm missing that you want me to address, let me know. That's a big question and a big point from Romina. Is the concept of SDP from the global north itself? I mean, that's a really hard question to answer. What I would say is that the organized institutional practices and mechanisms of sport for development and peace, I would say yes, it is from the global north. And that's one of the criticisms, even though the United Nations had a sport for development office, which is now closed and transferred to the Olympics. These, in theory, are global organizations, both north and south. But a lot of the ideas and the concepts behind development are located from the global north. But that's not to say, of course, that there were ideas and initiatives already happening in the global south, pre-existing sport for development, where sport could be used as a tool for tackling social problems. So what I would say is the organization around the use of sport as a development tool is predominantly a global north tool and device. Marcus, I'm struggling a little bit with questions and comments. Is there anything in the last couple of minutes of the stuff that I've missed that you want me to address, or should I move on to the fourth question, just recognizing that we're tight on time?
Yeah, I'm also
In general,
I'm also reading through
sorry,
it.
go ahead.
You can go on to the next question, please. But I will point out if there's anything I see.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, in summary, there seems to be a mixed response there, that recognizing there are some positives from global north influence, but also some negatives. So we're going on to D, which is the fourth of our 5 points that we'd like to have a little discussion around. So do you think that local led, which is what we've been talking about today, is self-determined programs that are based around local knowledge, local voices and priorities, would look and act differently? So our final question will talk about, if you agree they look differently, how they might look different. But let's talk about first whether you agree that local led programs would look different to the kind of templates and controls that global north organizations want to put in place. So do you think they would look different? And that's maybe coming back to a point that I was reading earlier from Jonathan about having to translate ideas and concepts for global north funders to make them more palatable and more digestible and more approachable. So if he didn't have to do that, what would these local led programs look like? Why would they be different? How would they look different? How would they act differently? Sam, I'm just reading your point here that we do also have cases of global south operations influencing global north operations. And you give examples here around Football Mass in France and MISA operating in the Czech Republic, obviously originally based out of Kenya. And that is a very important point. Obviously, I couldn't get into it today because of time constraints and concepts that I wanted to talk about in a little more detail. But very much my PhD research is also based around those, what I would describe as being counterflows that you're talking about. So these elements of global south organizations and knowledge as well coming to the global north and changing how we do things within SDP. So I very much do recognize your point. It's just something that I couldn't really get into today because of time, but it's actually something I'd really appreciate hearing your views on. So what I'll do is I'll put up my contact details on the last slide, which will have my Twitter handle and my email address at the university. If you could send me your details, and this follows for anybody else who has follow-up questions for me or would want to have a conversation with me about any of this. If you just send me an email with your details, then maybe we can arrange to have a chat on Skype or any kind of messenger platform in the coming weeks. Because I do value that. I didn't mention today about how there are flows that go the other way. Dina, I'm just reading your message here. I'm convinced that STP is also a concept within countries of the global north, and it's also a strong necessity there, not just a topic of development cooperation. I'm not 100% sure what you're getting at there, Dina. If you could just let me know. If I'm convinced that STP is a concept within countries of the global north and also has a strong necessity there, not just a topic of development cooperation. If you could just let me know specifically within that, Dina, what I should address, I would be happy to do that. I'm going to go on because we're coming to the top of the hour. I just want to get to the final point, which is conversation point 5, and then we'll wrap up and do the thank yous, and I'll post my contact details. If there's anything here that jumps out at you, we won't get through all of the subsections, but in terms of these local led programs, what might the differences look like? I was wondering if you had ideas from your own experiences of how either the social goals would look different to what a funder wants you to follow, the activities or mechanisms that you use or implement to try and achieve those goals, how your organization is either structured or how it looks from the outside or how it operates. Would that be different if you had free reign to do whatever you wanted and there wasn't influence from funders? In terms of success and monitoring and evaluation, would your measure of success be different? How would you measure success if you didn't have to file specific reports to funders? And indeed, anything else that comes to mind in terms of your own experiences of how you think a truly local led program that focuses on the priorities and knowledge and skill sets of locals would look different if there wasn't this sense of control from the global north. While I let you just type a final answer in for that question, I will take a look at some other stuff that's come through. Nancy's talking if they're allowed to and empowered to take control of the ownership of the process. So it's, again, very much supporting this true local led development rather than it being just a public relations exercise or something that you communicate but don't actually follow up on. Romina, bit of a tangent. How local do you consider local? Same country, same region, same village? That is a massive question, Romina. Of course, what counts as local is a massive part of this kind of question. And in my own research, for example, I have people who have migrated from African countries and are doing sport for development work in the UK and in Ireland. And in that case, what do we mean by local knowledge? There's no simple question to this because of the fact that we do live in an increasingly globalized world. So a lot of us share information that we're not as divided as we previously were into distinct countries, regions, communities within that. But that's not to say that there is still different knowledge based on areas. So I would struggle to answer your question in terms of putting a specific measure of local, because it will be so contextually dependent. So within specific communities and cultures, I would more look at those who identify with each other as that creating a specific locality. But I wouldn't be able to put a general mechanism for saying X square miles, or I'm talking purely about a community level rather than a regional level. But I do absolutely value your question and recognize the difficulty in defining local. But again, to come back to the main point here is that we don't want it. We want local knowledge to be those of the views of the people who the program's supposed to be helping. That's what I really mean by local. So instead of having external funders working in dozens of countries and providing funding, the agenda should be set by the people who the program is supposed to be helping. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but it gets to the sense in terms of who should be the decision makers and whose knowledge we need to take seriously and incorporate. While I've been answering that, I know there's been some more questions and comments coming in. Marcus, is there anything that jumps out at you, recognizing that we've gone past the hour?
Yeah, I
Otherwise, I
think, I
can
mean,
wrap
people
up.
are still active, so I wouldn't rush now with finishing up, although we will not drag on for too much longer. But I think Dina also made a good point, and I think that shows also the diversity of that topic when she mentioned in her comment that there's also NGOs based in within a country, for example, Germany, in that case, that operate within their own community and within their own country and do not only operate by cooperating with organizations in the global south, for example. I think that also is yeah important to recognize and to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. In no way am I trying to put forward a view that STP organizations who are operating from the global north are in some way bad. It's and again coming back to Sam's earlier point, of course there are examples of the global south coming to the global north, or as you just mentioned, Marcus, I think it was from Dina, organizations within the global north operating locally. So really what I'm talking about is one specific kind of flow, which is global north organizations operating as developers of countries in the global
Sorry.
south. But yes, of course, there's lots of other elements that don't fit within that template. I am reading through some of your questions and comments here, so apologies if I've missed anything as I went through. I am
I think
scrolling
it's also
back up.
interesting to see what the different answers were. Some people were saying the social goals. I think that was also there were three, four people that I saw that were emphasizing on that point. And then there was also some focus on the administration. Jonathan mentioned that the whole administrative point and how the organization is structured and operates. That's, I think, a huge impact as well, or would look differently if it would be locally led, not bound to restrictions that come from the global north. So yeah, that was interesting. Organization, Clara
Mm-hmm.
mentioned as well, that the organization would look different. Um, yeah, because they would be more locally based on what everyone learns in their own country, how things operate. I think that was also one thought that I had at the very beginning when you started to speak about institutions. And I was thinking, like, yeah, I mean, are institutions even necessary? Like, I think this idea of having institutions and organizational structure also don't apply to every area in the world. Sometimes issues, topics, social life gets addressed and moved forward in different ways and not just through institutions. So I think even the concept of institutions is quite strongly coming from the global north and the way they exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And all of those points and the point you just made about institutions, coming back to the earlier question about how do we go about in STP organizations addressing neoliberalism and neocolonialism? These are the kind of practical mechanisms which can go about addressing neoliberalism and neo-imperialism. So yes, start with creating an awareness, and that can be part of the education that's put forward through STP, that we educate kids everywhere about these kind of structural inequalities that are happening, while still progressing a view that, of course, their own decisions, their own actions, their own agency will decide relative success or failure in their lives. But then all of these points that we've just talked about in terms of whether an organization would focus on different social goals or whether they would be structured differently or whether they'd be part of an institutional network, these are all ways of creating difference and hearing other voices And that's what's required if we're going to prevent neoliberalist messages being the only way, or the only acceptable way, or the only approved way of how development should look like if it's to be successful.
Great. Thank you for these final words, David. I've seen you have already put up your contact details. So, for everyone who wants to get in touch with David and continue with these discussions or have some further questions, please don't hesitate to contact David. Thank you again for joining into this webinar today. Thank you to David for presenting to us today. It was again very interesting and broadening our view and showing us the complexity of the topic and the field that we are all working in. You as a researcher and many of us as practitioners. I just want to briefly give an outlook to the next month. The idea we haven't finally decided on it, but if you want to send us some feedback on it, it's also welcome. The idea is that in the next couple of months, we will go more into the practical side and see how do local led programs look like. And we might contact some of you to see if you would like to present a little bit the successes, the challenges, and so on that you are facing from a practical point of view. So today, after we have heard the academical side of that topic, we want to move on to the more practical side in the next couple of months and stay in contact and continue this conversation and discussion. So I hope to welcome you again in about a month from now, in 2 months from now, when we will continue this conversation. So thank you again to everyone who joined in today.
Yeah, thank you everybody as well. And again, thank you to Marcus and CAC for inviting me. And I hope everybody has a great day, and feel free to follow
Great.
up with me on any
Thank you very
particular
much.
questions or
This
conversation you have.
webinar has been recorded and will also be available on YouTube and on Facebook Workplace for you to watch again or to refer to anyone in your organization that you think would benefit from getting this input and watching the recording of the webinar. Have a good day. Have a good afternoon. See you all soon. Thank you. Bye bye.